Personal protective equipment, or PPE, is rarely treated with the legal severity it demands. Organizations often mistake it for a set of workplace safety preferences. In reality, it operates as a rigid, legally binding framework. The safety manual explicitly outlines the stakes in Chapter 2. Failing to enforce these standards opens an organization to strict liability and gross negligence. Strict liability means the employer is legally responsible for damages, regardless of intent, while gross negligence implies a conscious and voluntary disregard for the need to use reasonable care. Failing to maintain a fully compliant program provides the direct evidence required for these catastrophic legal claims. A missing audit document or an unchecked piece of damaged gear becomes the exact mechanism by which an organization loses its legal protection. The primary objective of any PPE program is hazard mitigation. The equipment acts as a physical barrier against chemical and radiological exposures and severe mechanical irritants, preventing toxic chemical absorption, dangerous atmospheric inhalation, or direct physical contact. This tree diagram maps the foundational regulatory framework governing these protections under the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA. The regulations are anchored in 29 CFR 1910. CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. This section maps out general industry standards, branching directly into subsections 132 through 138. These branches dictate the precise rules employers must follow to prevent those specific instances of absorption, inhalation, and physical contact. Every single subsection outlines a different anatomical or environmental mandate. Achieving full PPE compliance accomplishes two simultaneous objectives. It acts as an absolute shield, protecting the worker from severe physical harm on the job site, and strictly shields the corporate entity from massive legal and financial failure. The financial mechanics of protective equipment are governed by the OSHA Final PPE Rule, which took effect on February 13, 2008. The rule establishes an absolute mandate. Employers are required to provide all necessary PPE to their employees at zero cost. This ledger visualizes the cost of noncompliance. Passing the financial burden of protective gear onto the worker is a citable offense, carrying a direct financial penalty that reaches up to $16,131 per violation. The law creates a strict division between specialty equipment and standard apparel. The employer must pay for specialty items like chemical-resistant boots, thermal protective footwear, and high-performance respirators. Exceptions only exist for normal, portable safety boots or shoes that the employee can wear outside the workplace. This brings us to the liability trap of employee-owned equipment. Often, workers prefer to bring their own customized or comfortable gear to the job site. When an employee uses their own gear, the employer retains total legal oversight. You cannot contract away your responsibility for workplace safety simply because the worker bought their own helmet. For any outside equipment brought into the facility, management must strictly verify three criteria. The gear must demonstrate adequacy for the specific hazard, it must be subjected to proper maintenance, and it must meet specific sanitation standards. The financial ownership of the physical object has no bearing on the legal environment. The employer always owns the liability for the workplace hazard. Under 29 CFR 1910.132, management is required to execute a formal, documented hazard assessment of the workplace to identify exactly where and why PPE is needed. Identifying a hazard triggers an immediate cascade of required actions. The employer must execute the selection of gear that provides protection greater than the identified hazard, effectively communicate those decisions to all affected employees, and guarantee a proper physical fit for every individual to prevent equipment failure. Look at this rendering of a compliance document. This represents a major audit trap. Your physical safety measures are entirely void unless the assessment is certified in writing. During an OSHA audit, inspectors look for 4 non-negotiable data points on this record. The first 2 are the exact physical location of the workplace evaluated and the printed name of the person certifying the assessment. The document must also record the specific dates the assessment was performed, and it must bear the exact title, Certification of Hazard Assessment. If you provide the gear but failed to produce this specific document, your safety measures are legally non-existent in the eyes of an OSHA auditor. Distributing compliant equipment is legally meaningless if the workforce lacks verified, documented competence in how to use it. The training protocol requires mastery of foundational knowledge. Every employee must know exactly when PPE is required in their workflow and what specific equipment must be utilized for the task. Operationally, workers must demonstrate how to properly don and doff, or put on and take off, the gear. They must also be instructed on the exact limitations of their assigned equipment, along with the protocols for its care, maintenance, and eventual disposal. Initial instruction is only the baseline. Management must also track and enforce mandatory retraining triggers. The law specifies 3 events that legally mandate retraining. It is required when changes in the workplace render the previous training obsolete, when the type of PPE being used changes, or when an employee demonstrates a lack of proficiency or understanding on the floor. Safety training operates as a continuous requirement. It is directly tied to operational shifts and the real-time performance of the workforce. Head protection is governed by 29 CFR 1910.135, which mandates coverage against falling objects and electrical hazards. Equipment must align with ANSI Z89.1 standards. ANSI stands for the American National Standards Institute, a private nonprofit that oversees the development of voluntary consensus standards for products in the United States. This diagram breaks down the ANSI Z89.1 classifications. Class G, or general helmets, are designed to reduce the danger of contact with low-voltage conductors, and they are proof-tested to 2200 volts. Class E, or electrical helmets, are tested to withstand 20,000 volts for high-voltage environments. Class C, or conductive helmets, provide impact protection only and offer absolutely zero resistance against electrical hazards. Before every use, employees must execute a strict inspection of their headgear. They must physically check for ultraviolet light degradation, as well as fraying or broken components in the suspension system. We look at 29 CFR 1910.95, which governs occupational noise exposure. Under this standard, hearing protection must be managed within a comprehensive hearing conservation program. The effectiveness of ear protection is measured by its attenuation. Attenuation is the equipment's specific mathematical capacity to reduce the decibel levels that actually reach the inner ear. To verify that attenuation is working, employers must conduct audiometric testing. This medical testing identifies if a worker has experienced a standard threshold shift, or STS. An STS is a measurable decline in hearing sensitivity compared to the employee's baseline audiogram. Handing out basic earplugs or a standard hard hat is insufficient. Specialized gear must be mathematically matched to the exact electrical voltage or decibel hazard present in the assessment. 29 CFR 1910.134 outlines the standards for respiratory protection. The primary rule here is that engineering controls, like ventilation, must always be prioritized and exhausted before management issues respirators as a secondary measure. When respirators are required, you must differentiate between air-purifying respirators, which use filters to remove contaminants, and atmosphere-supplying respirators. Atmosphere-supplying units include the SCBA, or self-contained breathing apparatus, where the user physically carries their own independent air source. This data visualization compares the 2 mandatory fit test protocols required to evaluate the seal of a respirator. On one side is qualitative testing, which relies on a binary pass or fail based on the user's sensory response to a test agent. On the other is quantitative testing, which provides a precise numerical measurement of air leakage into the mask. A written respiratory protection program dictates that employees must pass medical evaluations to confirm they are physically capable of using the equipment. The program also demands annual fit testing and the strict verification of Grade D breathing air quality for all atmosphere-supplying units. These respiratory controls are heavily tested by hazards, like those governed under 29 CFR 1910.153 for respirable crystalline silica. Operations like concrete sighing or stone finishing produce microscopic particles that cause severe lung disease. The regulatory thresholds for silica are exact. The permissible exposure limit, or PEL, which is the maximum amount of a chemical a worker can be exposed to, is set at 50 micrograms per cubic meter over an 8-hour shift. The action level, or AL, which triggers mandatory compliance activities, is set at just 25 micrograms. If an employee is exposed to silica at or above that action level for 30 or more days per year, the employer is legally required to implement a formal medical surveillance program for that worker. Managing invisible hazards like microscopic silica dust and contaminated air requires precise medical and technical oversight. You cannot guess. You must measure the exposure and document the medical capability of the worker. A compliant PPE program is a fully integrated administrative and technical architecture. This structural diagram shows the 4 pillars required for compliance. The employer must bear the financial provision, execute a documented hazard assessment, maintain continuous training, and precisely match specialized equipment to the mathematical realities of the hazard. This identical structural rigor extends to all extremities, including chemical and thermal gloves under 1910.138, and impact or conductive footwear under 1910.136. We return to the initial legal threat. Building and maintaining this complete, documented architecture is the organization's only true defense against claims of strict liability and gross negligence. Executing this rigorous framework fulfills the employer's absolute legal obligations, while simultaneously deploying the final physical barrier between a worker and a life-altering occupational injury. Thank you for learning with QHSE Talks. If this comprehensive breakdown of PPE architecture helps your safety management program or your CSP preparation, please like and share the video.